Indeed. All right, let's turn to my home state of Virginia, the great Commonwealth of Virginia. Intense gubernatorial race, fully in swing now. Terry McAuliffe, who was the potentially once and future governor, versus Glenn Youngkin, who's this kind of like businessman who is trying to walk this this tightrope of appealing to the Trump base, but also his vibe is very just like suburban dad, sort of like, not too threatening.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to be working out pretty well for him so far, at least in terms of the polling is fairly tight in a state that Joe Biden won by 10 points, in a state where all of the statewide elected officials today are Democrats, where the Democrats hold the House of Delegates, that's the lower house, and the state Senate. So for the race to be this close at this point, already that should be warning signs for Democrats. And Terry McAuliffe, not my favorite politician.
But a good politician.
But he does have a tendency of like being pretty direct about what's really going on. And some of the problems he's facing uphill battle in the state of Virginia is a little too honest. This moment maybe on a recent Zoom. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
But we got to get Democrats out to vote. We are facing a lot of headwinds from Washington. As you know, the president is unpopular today, unfortunately, here in Virginia. So we have got to plow through.
Yikes.
President is unpopular today, unfortunately, in Virginia, a state he won by 10 points. Not a good sign for Terry McAuliffe, but I think he's right in that, listen, politics are national. That's why these races like in Virginia, California, other places, why they matter, because they show you a little like snapshot of what the national mood potentially is. And so he knows very much that his fate is tied to the popularity and the enthusiasm for the Democratic Party nationwide, and of course specifically in the state of Virginia. We've got a Washington Post article we can throw here up on the screen as well, breaking down the race. There was an interesting thing here because they talk about, there it is. So this is from Josh Kraushaar. He says, he's talking about the Washington Post article. Bruce Carlson considers himself mainly a Democrat. He voted for Terry McAuliffe back in 2013, but he is switching over to the Republican Glenn Youngkin because he believes public schools are pushing a radical agenda. What this article gets into really is that Republicans have hit on a few issues that are very energizing to their base.
Absolutely.
And Democrats are hoping that the sort of threat of Trump is enough to scare their people into showing up again for them, into keeping those suburban voters in their coalition. And I don't know the answer. It's a real open question mark. I think in California, at the end of the day, it did work. I think especially with that, radical Texas abortion law passing, that gave them a clear example to say, like, look, this could happen in California. It really couldn't have. But anyway, that's what they said, and people believed it. And they had a candidate in Larry Elder who was pretty, he'd said a lot of stuff. It was like very hardcore right wing in a state of California where it's not a good match. In Virginia, you have a candidate who puts off the vibes of like very, center of the road, reasonable Republican.
Right.
And so it makes it a lot harder to kind of freak people out in the same exact way. And then the last, the part of this Washington Post article that I thought was really interesting is I said, listen, it's kind of obvious to say, but it's going to come down to enthusiasm. So what are the indications of which side is more enthusiastic? Is it the early voting numbers that show far more people casting ballots so far, especially in Democrat-heavy Northern Virginia, than did at this point 4 years ago? So that would be a good sign for Democrats. Is it the slight edge McAuliffe holds in several recent surveys, or is it the thin margin Youngkin has in a couple of polls measuring the depth of voter interest in the race? And that is really the thing that Republicans have been hanging their hat on, is their side is a lot more engaged, more likely to say they're going to come out and vote, and all of those things.
Absolutely. And, reading this article, I mean, look, and again, this is totally anecdotal. I was out in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and then the week before that, I was in Loudoun County, which is, somewhat...
Loudoun's like exurban.
Right.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of Youngkin signs, a lot. And once again, signs is generally more of a thing of enthusiasm, but there seemed to be a lot of enthusiasm, especially amongst people who can either be more disproportionately Republican or a little bit more on the fence. And what you're reading here, and actually I also saw an ad from Terry McAuliffe while I was there on television, and it was exactly what you think, Krystal. It was just Trump. It was like, he said Trump's name like 4 times, and at the end it was like, I'm Terry McAuliffe, and I endorse this message. And it was like an audio recording of Glenn Youngkin saying something good about Trump, about how he was like a good force. I'm sure he's going to regret that come election day if he does lose. But more and more what you see in here, and even the headline of that story, emotions flare over Trump, COVID, and race. Here's the deal. Does Trump, COVID, and race have anything to do with the state of Virginia and actual politics? What is the Virginia governor going to do about that? Maybe on COVID, but even then, Virginia's not that strict on COVID, you know, even under Ralph Northam. Let's be honest. And you look at that and you're like, wow, it is just purely a national election. This is the true barometer about what's going to happen. And Terry McAuliffe, you know, kind of what you were saying earlier, he is begging Congress to actually pass something. So let's put this up there from The Hill, which is that in a more recent speech, he gave an interview and he was like, listen, I need Congress to pass this infrastructure bill or something because I need to show voters that Democrats are actually doing something in the House, or sorry, in Congress. He's like, we have got major frustration with Washington, and part of the problem is that he wants people to do that because he can see the frustration on the ground amongst some of the Democrats who voted for Joe Biden and for the Democrats themselves who are not passing anything. So what Youngkin, all he has to do is stand in opposition to these like macro political forces. McAuliffe is in a way trying to validate himself on Joe Biden's end, given the fact that he campaigned so hard for Biden in Virginia. He raised millions of dollars. I mean, and now launching himself into this, he is really having to try and ride the Biden coattails. And look, he said it himself. The president is unpopular in the state of Virginia. And part of it, it seems to be for Democrats, is they're pissed that nothing is passing in Congress.
It's a type of race that I absolutely hate because you have 2 standard issue corporate politicians. Neither one of them is going to govern all that differently. I mean, look, full disclosure, I'm going to vote for Terry McAuliffe. I live in the state of Virginia, whatever. But, you know, ultimately, rather than really focusing on, hey, here's what we're going to do for the state, this race all turns on who can freak their own side out more, who can make this the most existential, who can scare their people into showing up to vote. So it's a very uninspiring sort of a contest here, ultimately. But I do want to very strongly defend Terry McAuliffe on one particular thing that he is taking heat from.
Oh, right.
Let's put this Mediaite article up on the screen. Okay, so they're trying to paint him like a hypocrite for calling out Youngkin has kind of played a little bit of footsie with the Stop the Steal stuff, always really focused on election integrity, et cetera, et cetera. And so Dana Bash asked him, well, listen, you said that Republicans stole the 2000 election, so isn't this hypocrisy? And he's like, no, because actually there are some, this is my version of it, but he would not back down on this, which I fully support. It is not the same, okay? Bush had his brother as governor of Florida. The Supreme Court made them stop counting the ballots. And ultimately, when the ballots were all counted, Al Gore did get more votes in the state of Florida. So whether you buy that, you know, it was completely like it should have been Gore and it ended up being Bush, clearly there were some issues there that made it a true like contest and true actual conspiracy when you consider all the players that Bush had on his side. In the system, you had, remember the Brooks Brothers riots and all of this.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
All of this nonsense. So I fully support and defend Terry McAuliffe on these particular comments. He is right. Bush stole the 2000 election. That does not mean that Trump, you know, was robbed in this election. Just because one election was a problem doesn't mean all elections were ultimately a problem. So there you go.
I'm going to enjoy seeing that clip on social media from now on.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.